They said Americans tortured their prisoners, but the first thing they gave us was bacon. The voice came out as a breathless tremor from Private Wilhelm Hessler, former Luftwaffe mechanic, now a prisoner of war in Texas, 1944. His hands shook as he stared down at the breakfast tray before him. On it sat a single strip of crisp, golden bacon, its edges curling, its scent filling the mess hall like smoke from another world. Around him, dozens of German POWs froze mid-step. No one spoke. The sound of bacon sizzling on the iron skillet cut through the silence like a volley of gunfire. A few seconds earlier, Master Sergeant Ben Red McIntyre, the camp's cook, had grinned proudly as he dropped the meat onto the pan. "Smells like freedom, boys," he muttered, turning the slices with a fork blackened from years of ranch cooking. Red wasn't a cruel man. He was a cowboy who'd become a cook when the army drafted him. To him, feeding people, any people, wasn't politics, it was decency. But to the men lined up outside the mess hall that morning, this was not decency, it was confusion. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them that Americans were monsters, barbarians who mutilated prisoners, who shot captives for sport, who made them dig their own graves. And yet here they were, watching a red-haired Texan laugh as he served them breakfast like guests at his ranch. The line shuffled forward. Wilhelm stepped up to the counter, pale and thin from months of retreat and capture. Red nodded. "Go on, son," he said. "Ain't going to bite you." The smell hit him again. Salt, smoke, warmth. Memories flooded back. His mother's kitchen in Bavaria. A Sunday morning before the war, his father reading the paper while bacon crackled in the pan. For a moment, Wilhelm forgot he was a prisoner. He reached for the tray. His lips moved. He whispered, "Real bacon." Then his knees buckled. The tray crashed to the floor, the bacon falling beside him as he collapsed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos. Guards rushed forward. Prisoners called his name. Red knelt beside him, shouting for the medic. Wilhelm's eyes fluttered open, his voice barely audible. "I thought you'd poison us," he murmured. "Instead, you gave us home." The mess hall fell silent. Even the bacon stopped sizzling. And in that silence, something impossible happened. The war, for one fragile moment, felt like it was over. Before that morning in Texas, Wilhelm Hessler had spent 8 months fighting across Europe, from the skies above Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. He had watched his friends die under the roar of American bombers, seen his squadron torn apart by P-47 seconds, and heard endless propaganda about the horrors awaiting any German captured by the Allies. "The Americans are savages," their officers had told them. "They'll shoot you or work you to death." Never surrender. When his Messerschmitt was shot down and he bailed out over northern France, he expected to die. But instead, he landed in a field surrounded by US infantry. He braced for the end. The soldiers raised their rifles. Then one of them lowered his and said, "You all right, pal?" It wasn't pity. It was simple human concern, the kind that disarmed him more than any weapon. Captured and sent across the Atlantic by ship, Wilhelm spent the voyage in silence, waiting for the cruelty he'd been promised. But when he arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, the first thing he saw wasn't a whip. It was a baseball field. Wooden barracks stood neatly in rows. A guard offered him water. Another handed him a pack of cigarettes and said, "Welcome to Texas, Fritz. You'll be fine here if you behave." At first, Wilhelm thought it was a trick. He and his fellow POWs whispered among themselves at night, certain that the kindness was a setup. "They want us calm before the torture." One man insisted, "Don't eat too much. It's poisoned." But the days passed, and nothing happened. No beatings, no hunger, no humiliation. They were fed 3 meals a day, allowed to write home, even given tools to build furniture and plant small gardens. The shock wasn't in what the Americans did. It was in what they didn't do. They didn't gloat. They didn't hate. They treated prisoners with the same structured discipline they gave their own troops. For Wilhelm, it was more unnerving than punishment. The German system had trained men to obey out of fear. The American system seemed to function on respect. Even the guards joked and called the prisoners guests of Uncle Sam. One night, sitting on his bunk, Wilhelm wrote in his small notebook, "If this is captivity, then the propaganda lied. Their strength isn't anger." It's calm. The fear of American brutality dissolved, not through speeches or threats, but through something far more powerful: routine kindness. By the time he smelled bacon for the first time, Wilhelm's terror had already begun to crumble. What replaced it wasn't joy. It was confusion, the kind that breaks a man more deeply than pain ever could. By 1944, the United States was holding nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners of war on its own soil. The government had transformed farmlands, fairgrounds, and even rodeo arenas into temporary camps scattered across the South and Midwest. Texas alone held more than 70,000 POWs, Germans, Italians, and later a few Japanese spread across 70 facilities. The system was built not on vengeance, but on logistics. America understood that an army fighting across two oceans needed stability behind its lines. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a treaty, it was strategy. If America treated its prisoners humanely, there was a better chance its own captured soldiers would be treated the same way. But beyond the policy, there was something distinctly American about how it worked. Camp commanders were told to maintain order with fairness. They weren't to use humiliation or fear, but structure. Prisoners were assigned work on nearby farms, where Texas ranchers paid the government a small fee for their labor. In turn, the prisoners were given credits to buy goods at the camp canteen: soap, stationery, even harmonicas. For men like Wilhelm, this was unthinkable. In Nazi Germany, a captured enemy was the lowest form of life. Yet here, he was being paid by the enemy to pick cotton or fix fences. The American guards, many of them young farmers or ranch hands, didn't see the POWs as monsters. They saw them as workers who spoke funny and sweated under the same sun. One Texan sergeant said later, "We didn't have to hate them. They weren't shooting at us anymore." Each camp became its own strange little town. There were mess halls, post offices, infirmaries, and even libraries stocked with donated books. Prisoners held classes in carpentry, mathematics, and English. They built furniture for the camp and painted murals on the walls, landscapes of European hills under Texas skies. The U.S. War Department monitored the camps closely, knowing the moral optics mattered. Any abuse could be used by Germany for propaganda. So discipline remained strict but measured. Escapes were rare, not because of fear, but because most POWs quickly realized there was nowhere to run. Beyond the fences stretched miles of ranch, land, and desert. Still, the memory of combat lingered. Every morning when Wilhelm saw the American flag raised over the camp, it reminded him of the bombers that had burned his cities. Yet strangely, he didn't feel anger. He felt curiosity. How can they fight so hard, he wrote, and then treat their enemies like neighbors? The answer, he would soon discover, wasn't in the guns or the guards. It was in the kitchens, in the hands of a red-haired cook named Red McIntyre, who believed that food could do what bullets never could: make peace. Sergeant Ben Red McIntyre had never seen himself as a soldier. He was a ranch cook from Abilene before the draft pulled him into the army. He'd fed roughnecks, rodeo hands, and oil field workers, men who could fight hard and laugh harder as long as they were fed right. The army shipped him to Texas, not to fight, but to cook for a POW camp that needed meals for hundreds of German prisoners. Red didn't think of them as enemies. "They're just hungry men," he said, flipping cornbread one morning as the sun crept over the barbed wire. "And a hungry man's not dangerous if he's got a full plate." The guards liked him because he didn't make trouble. The prisoners respected him because he didn't pretend to be better than them. He spoke with a slow Texas drawl, always wore his battered Stetson, and ran his kitchen like a family diner. "No one leaves hungry," he'd bark, "and nobody complains about my biscuits." The kitchen crew included a few POW volunteers, men who'd worked in restaurants back in Germany. Red taught them American ways: frying bacon in cast iron, seasoning beans, smoking brisket. In exchange, they taught him to make black bread and potato soup. Somewhere between the smoke and laughter, they started to blur the line between guard and prisoner. Red didn't read war reports or care about politics. His war was fought over breakfast. He believed food was more powerful than orders. It could calm fear, bridge hate, even save souls. When a new group of POWs arrived thin, scared and half-starved, he made sure their first meal was real food, not army rations. He figured if America wanted to show its strength, it shouldn't be with guns, but with generosity. One day, while writing the weekly menu, Red noticed he had a small stash of bacon, real bacon, from a local rancher. Rations were tight, and most cooks would have saved it for American troops. But Red had an idea. "Let's give it to the Germans," he said. "Bet half of them haven't smelled this since before the war." His assistant stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're going to waste bacon on the enemy?" Red shrugged. "Ain't wasting if it changes something." That night, he trimmed and cured the meat himself. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and smoky. One of the POW helpers, the young man named Wilhelm, paused mid-task, staring at the sizzling pan as if it were a memory. Red noticed. "You miss it, huh?" he asked. Wilhelm nodded silently. The next morning would prove Red right. The meal he cooked that day wouldn't just feed prisoners. It would shake the soul of a man who'd come to Texas believing kindness was impossible. The sun had barely cleared the mesquite trees when the bell clanged for breakfast. The camp came alive. Boots on gravel, mess tins clanging, voices muttering in German. Red McCall stood behind the counter, spatula in hand, watching the line of prisoners file into the mess hall. The air smelled of coffee, biscuits, and something far more dangerous, bacon. He'd cooked 6 full pans of it, the sizzling fat popping like machine gun fire. Even the guards couldn't stop glancing toward the stove. Bacon was a rarity in wartime America, but here it was, crispy, golden, unapologetically rich. The prisoners moved quietly. They didn't joke or laugh, just shuffled forward in a silence that Red found unnerving. He could tell this wasn't just breakfast to them. It was a test. Wilhelm Hessler stood near the middle of the line, thinner than most, his face drawn tight from months of malnutrition. He hadn't said a word since arriving at the camp. When the man ahead of him received his plate, Wilhelm finally stepped forward. Red dropped 2 strips of bacon onto the tray and added eggs beside it. The smell hit Wilhelm like a punch to the chest. He froze, staring at the meat, unable to breathe. Behind him, another prisoner nudged his shoulder, muttering, "Move along." Wilhelm didn't hear him. The last time he'd smelled bacon was 5 years earlier in his mother's kitchen in Bavaria. He remembered her humming while it cooked, his father sitting at the table with the newspaper, sunlight on the window. He remembered being safe. The memory hit too fast, too hard. His hand trembled as he reached for the tray. The plate slipped, clattering to the floor. His knees gave way. The mess hall went silent. Red dropped his spatula and rushed forward. "Medic!" he shouted. The guards ran over, but Red knelt first, cradling the young man's shoulders. Wilhelm's eyes fluttered open, wild with confusion. His lips moved. "You?" he gasped in broken English. "You give bacon?" Red nodded. "Yes, son. You're in Texas now." Wilhelm stared at him, a tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. "I thought, you kill us." Red blinked, not sure what to say. He looked at the tray lying on the floor, the strip of bacon resting perfectly across the concrete, untouched. "Nah," he said softly. "We don't kill hungry men." The medic arrived, checking Wilhelm's pulse. "Shock," he muttered. "He's fine, just weak." Red stood, wiping his hands on his apron, still shaken. Around them, the POWs whispered among themselves, their faces filled with something new. Not fear, not suspicion, but disbelief. That day, word spread through the camp faster than any rumor or order. "The Americans fed us bacon," they told each other. "Real bacon. They could starve us, but they feed us instead." And for the first time since the war began, some of them wondered if they had been wrong about their enemy all along. Wilhelm recovered quickly, but something in him had changed, and so had the entire camp. By noon, the story had spread beyond the fences. Guards overheard German officers debating whether the bacon breakfast had been a trick, a kind of psychological warfare. "Americans want to soften us," one insisted. "It's manipulation," but others weren't so sure. They had tasted the same food, smelled the same warmth, and seen the same cook whose eyes held no hatred. For men raised on the Nazi belief that their enemies were monsters, the simplicity of that meal became something disarming. Red McCall didn't think much of it. To him, feeding people was just feeding people. When the camp commander later asked, "What on earth possessed you to serve bacon to prisoners?" Red scratched his neck and said, "Sir, I figured they looked half dead. Bacon brings folks back to life. The commander sighed, but couldn't argue. No one had caused less trouble in the past week than those same prisoners. In the barracks that night, Wilhelm sat awake, writing in the small notebook he'd hidden in his boot. "Today," he wrote in shaky German script, "the enemy showed mercy. I felt my hatred melt with every smell of breakfast." He didn't know whether he'd ever show the journal to anyone, but somehow it helped him make sense of the strange new world inside the barbed wire. The change was small but visible. The guards began hearing Danke at the serving lines. POWs volunteered to clean the mess hall or fix broken fences. When a storm blew through one night, flooding the camp's livestock pen, several German prisoners helped rescue the animals without being ordered to. Weeks later, an officer from Washington toured the camp and asked one guard why discipline was so good here. The man smiled and said, "It's the cook. He fights war with breakfast." Wilhelm often watched Red from across the mess hall. He couldn't understand everything the man said, but he understood tone, laughter, and kindness. Red sometimes offered him extra coffee or asked him to help peel potatoes. Slowly, with gestures and broken words, they talked. Wilhelm told him about his family's bakery in Bavaria. Red told him about Texas summers, horses, and his dream of opening a roadside diner after the war. One morning, Red asked, "What do you think of the bacon?" Wilhelm smiled faintly. It tasted like home. That single sentence stayed with Red longer than any medal he'd ever earn. When the next shipment of food arrived, more beans, bread, and canned goods, he made sure there was a little bacon tucked into the corner of every breakfast pan. The guards didn't question him anymore. They had seen what one hot meal could do to a man's heart. By then, Red's kitchen had become more than a mess hall. It was something like a peace treaty signed every morning over coffee and eggs. Weeks turned into months, and the Texas heat baked the camp dust into fine red powder. The war in Europe was dragging toward its bloody conclusion, but inside the wire, something different was happening. A quiet human ceasefire born of routine respect and Red McCall's skillet. Wilhelm and a few other POWs began receiving permission to write letters home under supervision. The Red Cross censored every page, blacking out names and military details, but no one stopped them from describing the food. "We are well treated," one man wrote to his wife. "They feed us like guests. Yesterday we had bacon and coffee, real coffee." The German censors back home didn't believe it. They assumed it was Allied propaganda, but the letters kept coming. Wilhelm's own letter was more personal. He wrote, "There is a cook here who wears a hat like a cowboy. He laughs all the time. He gave me bacon when I was too weak to stand. I think of him often." His mother, reading those words months later in the ruins of her village, wept. She had imagined her son starving in chains. Instead, he was being healed by kindness. In the camp, Red had started keeping some of the letters POWs wrote in gratitude. He couldn't read German, but he understood the tone, the loops of script, the underlined words, the smudged corners where tears had fallen. "Ever. They ain't much different than us," he told one guard over coffee. "They miss their mamas too." Not everyone agreed. "You're too soft, Red," one officer warned. "Feed them too well and they'll forget who lost the war." Red's reply was simple. "Maybe that's the point." One afternoon, as Red was cleaning the grill, Wilhelm approached with something clutched in his hand. A small wooden carving shaped roughly like a coffee cup. He'd made it from a piece of scrap fence post, the grain worn smooth by hours of careful sanding. On its side, he'd burned a single word, "Danke." Red turned it over, his throat tight. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Wilhelm just smiled. "You gave me back my strength. I give you my thanks." That night, Red placed the little wooden cup on the shelf above the stove. It stayed there through every meal he cooked afterward, a small reminder that sometimes victory doesn't come from a weapon, but from breakfast, shared between enemies who stopped being enemies, one plate at a time. By winter, the Texas winds had grown sharp, and the camp's routine had settled into something almost ordinary. But ordinary life didn't last long in a world still at war. One December morning, the prisoners gathered around the loudspeakers mounted on wooden poles near the mess hall. The camp commander had ordered a broadcast of Allied news, an attempt to keep the POWs informed and compliant. Wilhelm stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, listening as the announcer's steady American voice cut through the static. In the skies over Germany, Allied bombers continue their relentless advance. American factories have now produced over 90,000 aircraft this year alone. The numbers hit like artillery. 90,000 planes. It seemed impossible. Wilhelm looked at his fellow prisoners, pilots, engineers, mechanics, each frozen in stunned silence. They had once believed the Reich's war machine was unstoppable. Now, standing in a Texas field surrounded by abundance, they realized how wrong they'd been. Red McCall leaned against the mess hall door, wiping his hands on his apron, watching the scene unfold. He didn't speak German, but he didn't need to. He could see it in their eyes, the slow collapse of certainty, the dawning understanding that they had been fighting a country whose strength came not from hate, but from its ability to build. The broadcast continued, shifting tone. Back home, war workers are doing their part. Women in the factories, known as Rosie the Riveters, are assembling aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe can destroy them. Wilhelm's head lifted at that. Women building bombers. He tried to imagine his own mother or sister working in an aircraft factory. In Germany, women had been told their duty was to stay silent and obedient. But here in America, even factory workers became warriors. It wasn't just men who fought. It was a whole nation. Red stepped closer, offering Wilhelm a mug of hot coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said softly. Wilhelm hesitated before taking it, his hands shaking slightly. "It's not ghost," he murmured. "It's truth." The men around him began murmuring quietly, sharing fragments of disbelief and respect. "They make planes faster than we can shoot," one said. "Their women build bombs," whispered another. "And they still feed us bacon," Wilhelm added, half smiling. Red chuckled at that. "We do a few things right." Later that night, the camp grew quiet. Wilhelm wrote again in his notebook. "Today I heard numbers. 90,000 planes, thousands of ships, millions of workers. But it wasn't numbers that beat us. It was what those numbers meant. People united, believing they could build anything, even peace." He closed the notebook and stared through the barbed wire at the distant Texas stars. Somewhere beyond those lights, the world was changing. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Spring 1945 brought rumors faster than official orders. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. Germany was collapsing. No one knew what was true, but every man could feel the weight of something ending. The Texas wind carried that strange silence of history shifting, the pause before a new chapter begins. On May 8th, the confirmation came. A truck radio near the guard post blared the news in English. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Some guards cheered, others removed their hats in quiet respect. Inside the camp, the German prisoners stood frozen, faces pale and unreadable. Wilhelm was among them, staring at the ground. He had imagined this day 1,000 different ways, some defiant, some proud. But standing there now, the truth felt heavier than any defeat. It wasn't just the Reich that had fallen. It was the illusion that discipline and fear could match freedom and faith. Red McCall didn't celebrate right away. He walked into the kitchen, turned off the burners, and stood for a long time looking at the wooden cup Wilhelm had carved for him months earlier. Then he walked out to the yard carrying a pot of coffee and a plate of biscuits. When he reached the fence, he didn't say anything, just set the food down where the prisoners could see it. The silence was broken when Wilhelm stepped forward, eyes glistening. "You still feed us," he said quietly. Red nodded. "The war is over, son. That means we can finally eat like friends." Wilhelm's lips trembled. "You win," he said, but Red shook his head. "No, we all do." Later that evening, a small ceremony was held. The American guards lowered the camp flag to half-staff, out of respect for all who had died on both sides. Then, without orders, several German prisoners began humming a hymn softly, uncertainly. To everyone's surprise, the Americans joined in. Two nations that had tried to annihilate each other were now singing the same melody under a pink Texas sunset. Afterward, Red served one last meal, extra bacon, real butter, and strong coffee. No one spoke much. Words felt too small. One of the guards muttered, "Crazy, isn't it?" feeding the enemy after all this. Red wiped his hands and said, "Maybe that's how you make sure there won't be another war." That night, Wilhelm wrote his final entry in the notebook. "Today, I watched my enemy treat me as a man again. I saw mercy greater than pride, and I felt freedom greater than power. America has many weapons, but its kindness is the sharpest of all." When lights out came, Wilhelm lay awake, listening to the distant sound of crickets and wind through the barbed wire. He knew he would soon return to a shattered homeland. But he also knew he would carry something with him, something no propaganda could erase. In the stillness of that Texas night, surrounded by his former captors, Wilhelm whispered into the darkness, "They defeated us, without hate." Weeks later, trucks arrived to begin repatriation. The German prisoners packed what little they owned, mostly carvings, letters, and memories. The Texas sun was merciless that morning, baking the ground and turning every shadow gold. Wilhelm stood in line near the gate, clutching his small notebook and the wooden cup Red had given back to him the night before. "Keep it," Red had said quietly. "You'll need something to remember the good parts." The line moved slowly. Guards shook hands with men they had once guarded with rifles. Some prisoners wept. Others stood silent, too proud or too stunned to show emotion. When Wilhelm reached Red, the cook wiped his hands on his apron and said, "You're heading home, huh?" "Yes," Wilhelm said softly, "if it is still home." Red reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in paper. It was a single strip of cooked bacon, folded and cooled. "For the road," he said. Wilhelm stared at it, speechless. Red smiled. "Don't worry, son. It's not against the Geneva Convention." They both laughed, a quiet, fragile laughter that carried across the yard. As the truck rumbled away, Wilhelm looked back one last time. The barbed wire glinted like silver threads under the rising sun. Beyond it, Red stood at the mess hall door, raising his coffee mug in farewell. For a long moment, Wilhelm held up the wooden cup in response. Two men from opposite sides of a world war, saluting each other with the simplest symbols of peace, coffee and breakfast. The journey home was long. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying thousands of German POWs back to a continent in ruins. When Wilhelm finally reached Bavaria, he found his village half destroyed, his family hungry but alive. The first thing he did, before even unpacking, was pull out the wooden cup. He set it on the table and told his family about the cook in Texas who had changed everything with kindness and bacon. Word of stories like his spread across post-war Germany. Former POWs spoke of American camps where prisoners were treated not as animals but as men. They told of guards who shared cigarettes, of farmers who let them ride horses, of cooks who served them meals fit for friends. These stories, passed from one voice to another, became something more than memory. They became lessons. Years later, when Wilhelm opened his own small bakery, he hung the wooden cup above the counter. Tourists sometimes asked about it, and he would smile and say, "It came from a man who taught me that peace can start with breakfast." In 1961, he received a letter from Texas. The return address simply read, Red McCall, Fort Worth, Texas. Inside was a photograph. Red, older now, standing beside a new diner sign that read, McCall's Roadside Grill. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Still cooking, still fighting war with breakfast." Wilhelm laughed and placed the photo under the cup. In the War of Nations, guns may end battles, but it's the simple acts the plate shared, the kindness offered, that end hatred. And somewhere beneath a Texas sunrise, a cowboy cook once proved that the truest weapon in the world is a warm meal and an open heart. Would you like to explore other historical accounts of prisoner treatment during World War II?